Welcome to Intangibles podcast. I'm Steve BERG, your host. Success is driven by how as much as by what. How we communicate, how we lead, how we relate to our environment are all vitally important. Intangibles is a podcast that explores the underlying traits, qualities, and behaviors that improve the how. This is accomplished by finding the people who have studied and been successful practicing these soft skills and having informed conversations with them to get to what is learnable. Let's begin. Persuasion is achieved by the speaker's personal character when the speech is so spoken as to make us think him credible. We believe good men more fully and more readily than others. That's from Aristotle. I don't think Aristotle is discounting what is being said or how, but he is certainly giving the bulk of the credit for effective persuasion to who is doing the talking and what that person is about. My guest today, Jason Harris, I believe, agrees with this sentiment and is going to help explain the mechanics of effective persuasion. Jason is the co-founder and CEO of Mekanism, a premier creative agency in New York City. Customers he has landed included Alaska Airlines, Ben & Jerry's, OkCupid, HBO, MillerCoors, Peloton, a personal favorite of my partner, and the United Nations. He's the co-founder of the Creative Alliance, which is a force for good, and he's the author of The Soulful Art of Persuasion, a great take on what he has learned about influence and how to develop it over time. Hey, Jason.
Hey, what's happening?
Thanks for coming on the podcast. I
Great
think,
to be here.
yeah, we came up at nearly the same time, and I think we have a bunch of common things that we relate to. So I will tell you that I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time.
Oh, thanks, Steve.
And I think $5 for every time that you can work Bowie into the conversation.
Okay, good. No problem. I'll be a rich man at the end of this.
I think you might. But before we start, is there anything that I failed to mention about your background that you want to emphasize, or if you want to spend a second talking about Creative Alliance, whatever you want?
No, I think I can weave it into the conversation. I think you covered it.
Perfect.
So.
All right. So let's talk about persuasion. I'm going to lay out a couple of things just to kind of set the table, and then we'll dig in. First thing is, I'm going to tell you, as I understand it, an act of persuasion is kind of three pieces, right? The first piece is the person that's actually doing the persuading. The second piece is some kind of interaction, right? A communication, an act, whatever the thing is that is persuasive. And then the final thing, that's whoever it is, the one that you're actually being persuaded. You can't have an act of persuasion without each of those things being present. So for our discussion today, let's try to put some thinking around each of those pieces. Would that be all right with you?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, great. Before I begin on that, there's one thing that I just want your thoughts on. The title of the book, The Soulful Art of Persuasion. To me, soulful in the context that you're using it seems like a reference to being human, to possessing some kind of humanity and letting people see that. What do you, as a professional persuader, is that what you meant by soulful in this case?
It's part way what I meant by soulful.
Okay.
There's more to it than that, but I think the way you started this conversation with Aristotle, I think, is absolutely partially what I meant by it, which is that it's based on the simple observation that when someone persuades us or not has little to do with the words they use or the phraseology that they use, or if they say your name 15 times or not, which a lot of early persuasion books would tell you to do. But it's really about it's really less about the positions they take, but it's more about the person that they are. So my argument for persuasion is about character, and the book really is a take on what constitutes a persuasive character. So to me, part of that is humanity and humanness, and that certainly is part of it. But it is also made up of other elements. But soulful is looking, and part of character is doing things beyond yourself that can be inspiring to other people. And if you are inspiring to other people, you therefore will have stronger character and be more influential and more persuasive.
Yeah.
So that's the soulful part to me.
Sure.
That I think is important.
Sure. Not only important, I would say, based on my reading, essential.
Yeah, I'd say essential in my take.
All right. So back to the three parts of an act of persuasion: you, the interaction, they. I'm going to mention how the book says the you part of that should really be cultivated. And then maybe if you give me a little bit of color on each and tell me what you think about that, we can start to kind of get to the essence of it. The you in question, one of the things, it should be original, right? Originality seems to be important. And a subset of that may be authentic. So quickly, it doesn't have to be quickly, whatever you think, your thoughts on the notion of why one needs to be original.
So one needs to be original because that's the essential part of character, which we just talked about. Because if you aren't your unique self, if you don't know the things that you believe in, if you're not sure of your interests, your role models, what makes you you, and you're trying to mirror and match the other person, that will be sniffed out pretty quickly. And so part of the first part of your three-parter, you, interaction, and they,
Yeah.
in order to be persuasive, the fundamental element is that you have to be yourself. You have to be original. It's the Oscar Wilde phrase, be yourself, everyone else is already taken. And it's really about leaning into that. And it's less to me about, personal branding, like having a perfectly manicured social media, inauthentic personality. It's much more about being you and understanding the things you like, what you don't like, writing down a set of beliefs that you want to hold true to yourself. But that to me is really the fundamental underpinning of persuasion.
So I always think of it, or I was starting to think of it in reading the book as surface area for connectivity, right? Like having something that someone can mentally latch onto. One, maybe remember you by, you're the guy who loves Alfred E. Newman and makes his own pickles. Okay, great. That's a place where I can park that in my mind. But it's also like, back to the humanness aspect of it, it's also a thing that, is endearing, is thoughtful, is unique, and kind of makes you a human being.
Yeah, that's right. And I apply that to a lot of what I do at Mekanism, working with advertising and thinking of building brands. Brands also have to find their point of difference, and they have to be true to who they are, and they have to stand out just like people do. But it's less about, when we think of the brand of you or building brands, it's much more about what's in the core, where you start from and being true to that versus trying to jump onto the next pop culture wave and trying to stay trendy. It's much more about going into the core. And so that's easier to do as you get older, as you would know, when you start to care less and less about what people think. It's harder to do when you're younger and sort of coming of age, but you still have to do it then too. You still have to lean into your idiosyncrasies and be proud of them, not push them away, not shy away from them, and not try to match the person you're persuading and say, okay, this guy likes golf, so I'm going to fake it that I find golf interesting. You might find an interesting story they might tell you about golf, or maybe I like golf and they hate golf. That's interesting, but it should be wrapped in a story that connects the two of you together. That's the humanity part, right? And so the sooner you realize trying to define your own traits and your own idiosyncrasies and your own interests, the better off you're going to be in business.
Yeah, and there's the point I will tell people to go pick up the book, because the section that you write about how you start to almost self-inventory around those things that you believe in, I think that's, I think it's really well explained.
Yeah.
All right. So relatability, right? Somebody that you feel like you want to do business with, you want to talk to, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just in terms of the cultivating that part of self to ultimately be persuasive.
Yeah, definitely. Relatability is really important. And relatability comes from knowing yourself, right?
Sure.
And storytelling. Like, storytelling is a big part of it. And to be a good storyteller, you need to know, I talk about this in the book, but it's kind of like writing down stories that developed who you are and being able to retell them at the right time.
Yep.
Storytelling is another really important part of being relatable. And story always moves much more than facts or data do. If you're trying to persuade someone, the power of storytelling, we're as humans, that's what is in our memory banks. We remember stories. We don't Data goes in and out of one ear out the other. It's really stories that get seared into our brain.
Well, I will talk about that soon, but yeah, I think you're going to try and make the case that you can even convince people contrary to the facts if the story's good enough.
Definitely.
Yeah. So this is back to good old Aristotle, trustworthiness, right? This notion that people believe that the person they're dealing with is someone that's worthy of being dealt with.
Yep, that's important. Trustworthiness, yeah.
And this one in particular, you were just touching on it, but I'm gonna highlight some of the things. This system of values, serving a system of values. So that is not only is that's back to that self-inventory, right? But that is having things that you stand for, and people can relate to those things, right?
Definitely. Having a belief system is really important, and standing up for the things you believe in is really important. That's part of becoming an inspiration as well.
I thought, you highlighted a couple that I wouldn't have thought of as values, but as I think about them in retrospect are. So you highlighted loyalty. That's a strong value. Optimism. For you in particular, creativity and beauty.
Yeah.
The value of beauty, just struck me as so interesting. I had a long think about that as a value that you would serve. Let's see. Oh, authority is another thing about the you, right? Because authority actually equals influence, doesn't it?
Authority, definitely. Yeah.
So this is all of these things you want to build into yourself, right? As you're growing up, as you're coming up, as you're doing business, as you're in the act of making a persuasion, these are things that happen that essentially need to be cultivated, right? I think you're saying here that you've got to have a really solid source for the persuasive message, whatever that may be, to emanate from, or it doesn't really matter.
In terms of the source, yeah, you have to have that source has to come from that core part of your being has to emanate. That has to be the authentic part. Like, to me, you mentioned authenticity, and I think what I've learned in my career, and professionally and personally, that the idea of original, generous, empathetic, and soulful, add those together. This plus this plus this plus this equals authentic persuasion.
Nice.
That's the formula for me that I find works, which is why I wanted to write this book, to pass that on, because I've learned that through trial and error. And some things in that you'll be natural at, and some things you'll have to work at.
Right.
So, like, I'm not a naturally generous person, but I had to develop that habit. So now it's like in my subconsciousness, I am a naturally generous person, but I had to learn it. It was a learned behavior.
Yeah.
You don't come out of the womb being yourself, being empathetic, being generous, being inspirational. Like, it doesn't happen that way.
Yeah. Look, I think
they have to cultivate it.
I think you're one of the things that seems yes, this notion of cultivation, that means practice, right? That means conscious thinking about a thing and doing it time and time and time again until it becomes habit.
That's exactly what a habit is, right? It's repetitive practice that it goes from conscious practice to subconscious in your life. Like that's the transition that happens over time.
Right. And you really need to get there because that, I think we'll try to get to this, but that's kind of when it becomes magic, right? When it is unconscious, when that really is the actual authentic you and you're not trying to get to the authentic you.
Right. So then it becomes the authentic you, right?
Yeah.
But it takes work, for sure. And you could be a unoriginal, not generous person, and still find success. Like persuasion to me is binary. It's there's positive persuasion and there's negative persuasion, and both of those work.
Yeah.
Both of those work. It's just that negative persuasion will run out of juice. It's short term. You can make it's the Glenn Ross sell at all costs idea, always be closing.
Yeah.
It's ABC. That is a negative way to persuade, but it works. It will create transactions that you can do over and over and over, and you have to always find more of those transactions. Whereas positive persuasion and what I believe in, it's about playing the long game, building those relationships over time, and not doing short. It's letting go of short-term thinking.
All right, so that you're already on to the second.
Oh, sorry.
Thing. No. That's you're sometimes leading the witness, not so good. Leading the witness in this case, perfect.
Okay, good.
So the second part of it is the actual act of persuasion, and it's funny that you came up with a formula. Maybe it's not so funny. In taking notes for the book, I often saw things in terms of equations, and it could be that that's just how I look at things, how I function. But
maybe that's from your job, right?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, look, it's an occupational hazard. Before there's two formulas I want to touch, but before, let's define then. If we're talking about the act, let's define it. What is persuasion? Briefly, kind of as you see. What are you trying to do? Are you just trying to get someone to come around to your point of view, or what are you trying to do?
Yeah, I think you're trying to get somebody to understand where you're coming from. Maybe the ultimate thing would be to agree with you, but it is to show a point of view. And wherein, persuasion is in everyone's business and in everyone's life, there's micro acts of persuasion happening all day long. You may have convinced your family to leave the city and go to the Catskills, or it's time to come back into the city, or you want to have Italian tonight and someone else wants to have Chinese, or you want to go to Paris once you can go on vacation again and they want to go to Barcelona. Or you're convincing your boss to give you a promotion, or you're convincing a client to work with you, whatever it might be. We're in these acts of persuasion all day long, and the outcome of that is to try to get people to see things your way. And it's not you want everyone to agree with you all the time, and you want everything to every door to open for you and everything to work out perfectly. But it's to get your point across, really. And it's to persuade people and get your point across so people understand where you're coming from.
Okay.
And that's yeah.
Okay. So this is a good foundation, because my first it's not really a formula now that I think about it, but there's a formulaic piece here. Persuasion not equal to, so persuasion does not equal insisting. Instead, persuasion equals engaging.
Insisting is not letting the other person feel heard. It's pushing to have your way. It's leading through fear and authority. Engaging is quite the opposite. It's bringing people along with you. It's sort of the difference between being a leader and being a boss, right? A leader inspires and engages. A boss gets everyone to march along to what they want because they said so.
Yeah.
It's like, when your parents said that.
Because I told you to.
So. Because I told you to. But you're not explaining why I told you to or how that is going to benefit you.
Yeah.
And so that's really what engaging is. Engaging is to find the collaborative property that makes both of you feel like you're working on something together and getting the other person over to your point.
Yeah. So that's formula 2 for me, right? So you're talking about persuasion, not coercion, right? Not that I told you so, not because I'm bringing force or fear or whatever. Instead, persuasion is attraction to an idea. Hey, you like this because you want to go to Paris with me instead of Barcelona because.
Right. Yeah. It could be engaging. Could be watching a movie about Paris and the romance of Paris to show that you want to go to Paris with this person for these reasons versus no, that, I'm paying for it and that's where we're going.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's showing, not telling, I think, it's bringing them along for the journey, but you have to really understand why you're motivated and what you want out of it in order to show it in a new way and to persuade. But it takes, it's much easier to just put your foot down and end the story. It's much harder to bring people along with you and engage.
You're an advocate of playing the long game when it comes to persuasion. You view the short-term or transactional, even as you mentioned already, as actually not even genuine persuasion, right? What comment on that a little bit, the notion of the long game, what that means to you and why that's so much better.
So playing the long game is about building relationships over time. It's kind of a mental way of thinking about persuasion. And so when I'm in the business of pitching, a lot of people are, right? So you're always pitching clients' business. In advertising, our game is you give away the IP first. You pitch, you're in a pitch with other agencies, other competitors. You're giving away your ideas for free in hopes of getting paid for those ideas, which is a bad business proposition to start with, but that's the industry I picked. And I used to run through pitches and I would think about them as like we either won or we lost, and if we lost, I would just quickly move on. Then I started to change my way of thinking into this idea of the long game and thinking, okay, well, if we lost, I've just spent 4 or 8 weeks working with this client to try to crack what they need from a business standpoint. I built this relationship. I'm going to keep that relationship going. I'm going to hit them up every once in a while and send them industry relevant information. Or if I got to know some books they like or role models, I'm going to stay in touch with them. And I played the long game on some of these relationships. And what ended up happening is inevitably that business would come back to me in some way. It was, and you don't do this because, I'm going to get all the business I ever pitch in the world. You do it as a way of just not letting relationships go to zero, not dropping relationships to zero that you've invested time in, just for that sake. Like that's just the mindset. But invariably what happens is you cultivate those relationships more and more, and they become real relationships, and you end up doing work together, or you get referred to another client. But it's been very, very successful in helping, as an entrepreneur, helping me build my business. But it was a switch. It was a conscious switch. And now when I don't win a piece of business, I think of, well, that's just no for right now. It's not no forever. And in the past, I used to just think that's no forever. Let me go through the list of other pitches and other clients and just keep going. And so to me, it's moving from purely transactional yes or no thinking to building these relationships over time.
Right.
And I that's a business standpoint. There's a personal way to view it also. But sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's really hard to put your finger on, but over time, something magic happens, right? When it's just about one person connecting with another person and, people deciding who they really want to work with, right?
Yeah.
And if you've been one of those person who didn't just show up to say, can I have something? Or, okay, no, you're out of here.
Right.
All of a sudden that person sees you, right? The one doing the persuading,
Yep.
whatever, as something different. And once they see you as something different, it seems like it paves the way for a more full or richer relationship that often does have, some transactions or some
Down the road,
business
yeah.
relationships that go with it.
Yeah, it can pay off with compound interest down the road if you invest the time. You're right. And you're not going to do that for every relationship, right? Some relationships, maybe there wasn't chemistry, you didn't connect, you don't feel like building that relationship. Like, it's not every relationship's for sure, but it's a way of thinking that is, just taking the long view versus running from piece to piece to piece in business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's also, the opposite of it is, you're building up trust over time. But, if you're short term in your thinking, you may actually be building up skepticism, right?
Right.
And that makes it just that much harder to ever get anything done, right? Because people just put up their guard.
They view you as just looking. You can sense when someone's just looking for the money, right?
Right. Yeah.
When they're just looking for the sale. Yeah.
Yeah. I always loved that Shep Gordon story.
Oh my God, I love Shep Gordon. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, tell that story real quick.
Okay, so first of all, he only built his relationships with handshakes. He never had contracts, and he managed the careers of Alice Cooper, Blondie. He started with Emerald, the celebrity chef craze.
Yeah.
I mean, he has done.
He's an
so
agent.
much.
So for people who don't know, Shep Gordon is an agent, right? And that's a relatively sleazy business for the most part. This guy's not that.
Yeah, like advertising. Advertising is there's a Gallupo that I talk about in my book that the least trusted in businesses or jobs it was a Gallup poll a couple of years ago. It was the most least trusted, or the least trusted job was congressman, then used car salesman, then advertising practitioner. So my business is not very well regarded, and I hate that. Like, I hate sharing the podium with a bunch of untrustworthy professions, and so that's even made me more emphatic about the principles that I apply and trying to sort of change that conversation. But agents would be right up there, right?
Yeah,
they're
typically,
and they're slimy, and they're just making money off of the backs of the real talent.
But somehow Shep was different than that, right? Like he really loved the people that he worked with, and he was all about it was only about the relationship.
It was only about building those relationships and looking out for their career long term, and whenever he was with them for the long haul, and he's had relationships that span their entire career because of it. And right. He's just amazing.
And he was all about providing value. I think I recall him saying at one point, look, if you ever find that I'm not being valuable to you, then that's fine. Then you can go your own way. Then you can go another way.
And a 40-page contract's going to not make a difference, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you really have to believe a lot of things to be able to navigate the world that way. Yeah. So yeah, but you're right. That's just an amazing. Okay, so now it's storytelling. I know you this is the heart and soul of what you do, and we talked about the notion that most powerful mode of persuasion, but you don't actually have to have evidence. It's better than evidence or argument or logic. How is that? Why is that? Is there something going on in your brain that a story is better than logic?
Yeah. So there's a psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, who puts it best, And he said that the human mind is a story processor, not a logic processor. We remember the way a speaker makes us feel and the emotion of the story they're telling us rather than the facts and figures. And I think when I think about the most powerful historical figures, like think about MLK, you know, when he's trying to talk about equal rights, he's not throwing down socioeconomic numbers, or he wasn't throwing down socioeconomic numbers. He's talking about having a dream, right? Where his children could live like any other children. And he's telling you a story of a future. And that's why he's quotable and memorable and had such a massive impact, like, you know, very few people have to this day. And, you know, when you think of the Gettysburg Address and Abraham Lincoln standing on the bodies of, you know, the Civil War in Gettysburg, of all these dead, thousands of dead soldiers, he's talking about, you know, 407 years ago, and he's telling you a story of the founding fathers. And that isn't, you know, this is how many people died, and this is why we're doing it, and these are facts and figures, and this is how it's going to eventually help the economy, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are stories that we remember forever, and those are historical stories. And you know, today people are the same. They remember you telling a story from your heart and what it means to you, and that is how the mind works. And not that facts and figures don't work. Like you can support it, you can have insights. I'm sure in your business, you know, data is of primary use. But if you take that data and don't weave a story around it, it's pretty useless. You know, it's just numbers. If you take that data to create a story supported with a footnote of, hey, by the way, here's the supporting data, then you've got something really powerful. And so I think we've lost a little bit, as, you know, modern humans, we've lost a little bit of that ability to tell stories. Everything is so image based and momentary. It's all fleeting. I think we've lost that storytelling skill a little bit. But everyone should be cultivating that and think about it. And I've spent a lot of time trying to learn how to do that, both for my own personal life, but also for the brands that I work on.
Yeah. It's a different part of your brain, right? And as a result of that part of your brain just happens to grab onto things more tightly.
Yeah.
So I'm skipping ahead a little bit. So
Sure.
you've emphasized collaboration as a tool for persuasion. We're still in, you know, chunk 2 here. What's the actual act? It's almost like a trick, collaboration, I think, in some ways. And I don't mean it to make it seem like it's a hack or something. It's not, because there's science behind it. But if someone is helping you, bring you to a decision point or a transaction point, they've already invested in a positive outcome to that thing, right? They've invested in success. Let's talk about the value of collaboration as a tool for persuasion.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, when you call it a trick, it has sort of a negative connotation.
Yeah.
And I think there's something in that, though. Like, there's something right about that, because it is a skill. It's like a learned skill to be collaborative to get the outcome that you want, right? Like, I guess it kind of is. It's a trick or it's a tool. But when you and you see that in business, you see it in your personal life. When you surprise people of an outcome you want and they're not along for the journey, it is very hard for them to buy into it. And that happens personally and professionally. And so if you're looking to persuade somebody, your chances of winning them over jump dramatically when they feel they had some input into that decision. And when you don't make them feel that way, and you don't act, or not even act, if you aren't trusting their judgment or interested in their well-being, the outcome's probably not going to be what you want.
Right.
And
right.
so, we have in a business that I run, we have this phrase called assume genius. And I've worked at a lot of advertising agencies, and you can apply this to any business, where we would act as if we had to save the client from themselves. We would have to figure out a way to get an idea across and make them buy something, even if they didn't want to. And we have this idea of assume genius, which is assume the person on the other side of the table is as smart or smarter than you are. And when you go in with that mindset and you set up for collaboration, you're going to really value their input, and you're going to come out with something at the end of the day that they'll be happy with and you'll be happy with. It's easier said than done, and I realize that. But this idea of collaboration is, it is a tool that you have to use. So I'll give you a quick story from the book, if I can. So it's, the Ben Franklin effect. I talk about this, but that the idea is, Ben Franklin was a legislature in the Congress in Philadelphia, and he came from a poor family. He wasn't educated. There was a well-to-do legislator across from him who did not think Ben Franklin belonged in this sort of esteemed house, right? And this esteemed line of work. And he would always shoot down Ben Franklin's idea. And Ben Franklin, being the smart guy that he was, instead of confronting this man, he was an avid reader. He knew this man was an avid reader and had a great set of books. He knew that there was a particular book that he had heard from a friend that this guy owned. He asked him to borrow the book. So, this is an adversary that is confronting Ben Franklin all the time. He asked this man to borrow a book. The man was just taken aback that Ben Franklin knew about this book, asked to borrow it from him because he knew he didn't like Ben Franklin. And they bonded over that book and became lifelong friends. And so the way he collaborated was he asked this man for a favor to borrow something from an adversary. And that was the connective point. And they collaborated and discussed this book and the fine points of the book. And so that's a long way of saying you can even go to an adversary and ask for help, which is very counterintuitive, but that creates a collaborative bond.
Yeah. I mean, as I understand that story, like once this guy lends the book, he now has a vested interest in his success. I have helped you, therefore I want you to succeed in the thing that I have helped you for. Okay, it is no longer you and I, it is now we.
It is now we, yeah.
And once we get to we, it's going to be way harder for them to say, no, man, no, we can't do that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And think about how advanced and capable you have to be to put yourself out there to somebody who despises you to ask for a favor.
Total jujitsu.
It is.
The thing that I found that's so odd about that is, so we're creating this authentic interaction, but we're having to practice it, right? Something that is habitual, right? Like you have to think about, okay, we're going to create a collaboration here, right? That's not that's an unnatural act, right? But practiced over time. So here I am practicing a thing so that it can become authentic, right? That's kind of weird, right? So
it sounds kind of fake, right?
Yeah, but it to be clear, it kind of starts out that way, right? But you're trying to become what it is that is the best thing, the best you, right? And so in doing that, you really do get to the point where you're authentic.
Well, yeah, and you have to read this. You have to read the book and believe in the principles and want to embody those principles. So it's not really inauthentic,
right?
Because your goal is to strive to be more generous.
Right.
Like I was never a generous person. I had to learn that, and so but I knew I wanted to be, right? And so it's still authentic in the motive and the outcome that you seek, but you have to practice to make that who you become.
Right. Who you really, right. At the beginning, you're not really that. And so it's hard and it's kind of weird. But by the end, you are really that. And once you are really that, then that's kind of the best way
who
to be.
you are.
Yeah, that's the best way to be.
That's right.
All right, so let's think through. Let's talk about that final piece. And frankly, I find this piece to be most interesting because putting myself in other people's shoes is something that I haven't been particularly good at and want to be better at. So the final piece, that's the they piece, right? The ones that we're trying to persuade. And my sense is that if you really understand, and more importantly, if you really care for the person or the entity that you're trying to persuade, it's much easier, right? It's much easier if, you like them, you want the best for them, you want to succeed, you want them to succeed. If you want that for them, then you're probably doing things that you feel are in their best interest. And so if they can agree to those things, then that's just a win-win, right?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So in my mind, there's a certain empathy required here, right? Like you have to, I guess the definition of empathy is you be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So all right, why do you figure then that empathy is part of persuasion? It seems a little counter, doesn't it?
Not really.
Okay.
It seems like it's a necessary, well, that's because I believe it, but it's a necessary ability. In order to persuade someone, you must have a certain understanding of where they're coming from.
Right.
Right.
That's right.
So if you don't have that certain understanding of where they're coming from, it's going to be very hard to get them to see your point of view or go where you want to take them.
Right.
Because you don't understand the barrier of why they don't see, you know what I mean? So like I this example that, I know a friend of mine was really against anyone coming into this country, really against immigration, really of any kind, and against immigrants in general, even though we're a nation of immigrants. And I couldn't understand that philosophy. Of course, we all could have different political views, and that's fine. But I had to unpack and be empathetic to understand why, versus just saying we're the nation of immigrants and we need to carry on that tradition, and here's why, and that's how the country was founded, et cetera. I found out that there was a period of time in his life where his family was homeless and on the streets when he was younger. And his dad's job was taken away, and an immigrant was hired who was sort of off the books and paid much less than he was, and he became obsolete, and therefore they couldn't survive or work, and they were in shelters, et cetera. They ended up being okay after that. But going through that experience created a visceral enemy or hatred out of immigrants coming illegally into this country. And that point that understanding why the reason was, we were able to have a much healthier conversation about the limits and how it could work and our different viewpoints. And that was instead of just being in locking horns like rams, we were able to have a discourse that was positive.
Yeah. That's a great story. I was going to go back to Paris and go, look, you cannot convince your partner to go to Paris unless you can understand, how they think about going places, right? But yes,
that's a great example. Yeah. Like why do they hate Paris so much?
Yes,
and
that's right. Because they were a French orphan when they were quite young, and that they've got an aversion to Paris.
There you go.
But I think your story. Probably will stick with people longer.
But that's why empathy is critical. It's really, you summed up empathy like very succinctly. The ability to understand others is fundamental to persuasion.
Yeah.
And it also shows that you take the time to unravel what they believe in so that you can try to get them on board.
So look, when I was listening to you tell your story, what really struck me was you cannot be empathetic without being curious, right? You wanted to know, why was that other person approaching it this way, right? You needed to understand that. And I'll go a step further, that beyond being curious, you actually had to listen to that person, right? You had to really hear what they were saying and kind of feel like, in their words, feel like, oh, this is why there's, that person hurts that way, or this is why that person's motivated that way.
Oh my God, I almost wish I called that third principle curiosity. I love that idea, because that's really what it is. It's really part of being empathetic in the sense that I'm talking about it is listening to other people and being curious about other people, having that sort of, it's not being a bleeding heart,
No, right.
In that way, it's about having a natural curiosity about other people.
So again, there's just so much, irony isn't right, there's just so much counterintuitive nature about, to really be persuasive, you have to be a good listener.
Yeah, you really do. Yeah, exactly. Which is the opposite of
talking much. Yeah.
And selling and convincing.
Yeah. All right, look, we're getting to the end here. This is the one that you've mentioned a number of times. Your belief in giving as a way of nurturing relationships. And, that could be, from my impression, it could be time, it could be advice, could be recommendations, could be stuff, right? It could be like, here's just a memorable.
I use stuff a lot. Yeah.
It could be. Maybe that's not as important, but nevertheless, you believe in that. And there's some science, there's some brain science behind it, but I think that your view is probably a little more down to earth. Talk about why you were so, why you put this in the book and why you believe in it so well.
Yeah, I believe in this idea of giving away things without expecting anything in return.
Yes.
And so to me, this was a big unlock, one that I really, really personally had to learn. I was born or nurtured, you may make the case either way, to really be a bit self-centered and really think about my needs and, original, like, for example, came more naturally to me. But this idea of like giving things away without expecting anything in return was a learned behavior. And the idea is, the mindset is, whenever you cross paths with someone, try to leave them a little bit better off than before they cross paths with you. And that could be advice, connections, it could be interest, it can be things, like you said, it can be things, like there's nothing wrong with that, but it shouldn't be, that's not the gist of it, isn't things. But it could be listening, it could be curiosity, that's also being a form of generosity. But that is the mindset that will benefit you, personally and professionally down the road. It's just having that switch of thinking about other people that way, and it'll make you feel like a better person. Obviously, it'll make you feel good,
yep,
more importantly. But you're stepping outside of yourself, and you're realizing there's a common, greater humanity among all of us. It's more important than the individual.
So, the thing is, I was thinking about this empathy and curiosity, and we talked about the, being able to put yourself in other people's shoes. I think that the act of giving, as I was relating it to what we were talking about, you have to actually put yourself, you have to identify the other person's need state. Sorry.
Yes.
So
yeah.
That means, it's not the thing, it's that you actually had to take a moment before the thing to think about, what do they think? What could they use? What would be good for them? Right?
Yeah.
Again, like, once you can do that and you can kind of look through their eyes, you've got to be able to be a better persuader, right? You understand them, what motivates them, how they proceed in their day. You're just bound to be better.
That's exactly right. And it also, people love to know that people are thinking about them. Mm-hmm. People just love that electric, hit of, oh, that's thoughtful. They remembered when I said, I love that role model, that person or that book or that story or that I love Disneyland. They sent me an article about Disneyland. That makes me feel good. That's like a hit that they listened, they were curious, and they sent that to me. And so one thing that I try to practice is, because I think being a generous person can be reminding people that you're thinking about them. And in a social media world, we're so used to, if we see something, we just post it. And so everyone that follows us can see it all at once.
Right.
When I see stuff, I do that too, of course. But sometimes I'll think of, if I read an article, oh, this is a really fascinating study or a really fascinating article. Who do I know that is into X, Y, and Z? I'm going to send it directly to them instead of just like, posting it, moving on. And I think that's another form of generosity, I think.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. So look, I'm sure we could go on about this, but I'm looking at the clock. We're running out of time. There's just, I want to leave that as our concluding thought on this act of persuasion. Typically right at the end, I just kind of open it up a little bit, just to make sure that we covered everything that you think is significant. I'm going to ask you 3 more quick questions. Is there something about the topic that you would like to address specifically that we haven't really talked about, that you're just like, oh, that's a complete oversight, we've got to talk about this, or our conversation not complete?
Yeah, definitely. So that thing would be this idea of being inspirational. And when I talk about being inspirational, being yourself is great. Being understanding other people and being empathetic is critical. Being generous by nature as well. This idea of soulfulness that we touched on sort of at the beginning, and being inspirational to others, it really does take one more act. And that one more act is thinking about what you can give back to the world as a whole. It's not articles and connections and thoughts and goodwill towards other people. It's also, what skills do you have that you can leverage to make the world a little bit better? And that, again, is stepping outside of yourself. And it is, it's part of being soulful. And I'll give you an example of my friend, Josh Combs, who was a hairdresser. So it shows you, like, no matter what line of work you're in, anyone can do this. And he was a hairdresser. And this happened to me in advertising. I was like, okay, I guess I'm running an advertising agency. That's like my life. And I leveraged my advertising powers to do good. Even, this guy's a hairdresser. He's an incredible barber. One day at lunch, he was in London. He lives in London, Josh Combs. One day at lunch, he went out and cut one homeless person's hair and had a conversation with them and cleaned them up. And they had dignity for that day. And they felt like that was a special day for that person. The next lunch break, he did it again. Then he was doing it one day a week. Before you know it, he was like traveling the world, on staying in hostels, with whatever money he could leverage, getting some donated money funds to do this. And he would go around the world and talk to homeless people and clean them up and take pictures of them. And then he became a speaker doing this and getting paid speaking way more than he ever was as a barber. And it's not to say do good and you'll make more money in the end. The point of the story is, apply whatever skill. And even if you just stuck with doing one lunch break a week and helping one homeless, that would be enough. But it's applying your skill to a higher purpose than yourself. That will make you an inspiration to other people, which will make you more influential, which will make you a more soulful person.
Beautiful. Good story. All right. The next one, I don't know, you're probably bombarded these days, but maybe you're not. And people that will listen to this and they're like, what, I got to connect with Jason. Where do you connect with people? If so, how do you connect with people? Maybe people want to work with you, that kind of thing. What's the best way?
Yeah, sure. All the time. Yeah. So the soulfulart.com is the website for the book.
Yeah.
And then you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Jason_Harris. And I people that reach out, I always connect with them.
Nice.
Yeah.
And then materials that you would recommend besides your book. And I would say, by the way, before you answer this question, you should probably reference David Bowie.
In this, yeah, you're right. God damn, I forgot. David Bowie.
I'm totally kidding.
I would pick up any David Bowie album and play it on repeat.
Station to Station just turned what, 30?
Yeah.
Jesus.
You know, any of them. Ziggy Star. I have like my whole apartment is littered with David Bowie artwork. But I'll pump another book that was very breakthrough for me also.
Okay.
And that is The Obstacle is the Way.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know that
book.
Oh,
sure. Yeah, he's been on my podcast.
Yeah, I know. I saw that. But he's a friend of mine and a big inspiration. But that book, really the power of learning when hard things happen to you and the power of how you come out the other side of it. That's a book that anyone should read at any point in their life.
So that's Ryan Holiday. Just in case everybody knows, The Obstacle is the Way, and he's got a more recent book as well that people should also check out.
Yeah, so that book's one of my favorites.
There you go. So I'm sure he'll now throw you $5 too, so probably makes up for the $5 that you didn't get from me.
Okay.
Jason, look, man, that's the end of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think it's been a helpful conversation. I appreciate you being generous with your time and coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Until next time. This has been Intangibles. You can find this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and many other podcast platforms. You can also find it at its home on the web, which is www.intangiblespodcast.com. I'm Steve BERG. Thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode.